June 1944, Cherbourg. The war was supposed to be about tanks, guns, and flags, not about equations. Yet on that gray morning, amid the smell of diesel and the groan of machinery, a German engineer stood frozen before a scene that defied everything he had been taught. British soldiers were dragging an oil-slicked steel pipe from the surf, clamping it into place and feeding it into the earth like a vein. The engineer's name was Friedrich Adler, former structural analyst of the Wehrmacht's Fuel Logistics Division. He had spent the last 3 days under British custody, hands bound, mind racing, watching the operation unfold in silence. Adler pulled from his pocket a small notebook. The pages were damp and trembling in the wind, covered with equations. Bernoulli's principle, head loss due to friction, thermal contraction in cold water. He recalculated every constant. He adjusted for viscosity, flow velocity, and pipe length. Then he stopped, looked at the sea, and whispered to himself, "Es ist unmöglich." Impossible. Even under perfect pressure ratios, the line would fail long before the channel floor. Oil couldn't be pumped through that distance without bursting the pipe or losing half its flow. Every number told him the same truth. It couldn't work. A young British sergeant nearby noticed the man's confusion. He was covered in grease and laughter, his uniform smeared with salt. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, tightening a valve. "Fuel for an army, under their noses." Adler didn't respond. He pointed at the pipeline and murmured in broken English, "It breaks the law of physics." The sergeant grinned, wiping his hands on his jacket. "Maybe, but we didn't study what can't be done. Only how to make it happen." Then he turned back to his work, humming an old marching tune that vanished into the wind. The moment hung in Adler's mind like a wound. He had spent his life believing in certainty, in equations that define the limits of man and matter. But here, on a ruined French beach, he saw the opposite. An empire built not on conquest, but on belief that the impossible was only temporary. That day, even before he knew the project's name, Pipeline Under the Ocean, or PLUTO, he felt something inside him collapse, the arrogance of reason meeting the quiet defiance of imagination. In the distance, an oil pump began to throb, slow and rhythmic, echoing across the shore. The sound wasn't military. It was almost human, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. For the first time, Adler realized that numbers might not be enough to win a war. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Long before Friedrich Adler stood on that beach, the story of PLUTO had begun in a small, smoke-stained workshop in Surrey 2 years earlier. It was 1942, and a 27-year-old petroleum engineer named Arthur Hartley sat at his desk at the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company with a single audacious thought. What if fuel could flow under the sea? He had been laughed out of meetings before. "Your math belongs to poets," one senior consultant told him. But Hartley wasn't trying to be poetic. He was desperate. The Allied armies were burning through thousands of tons of petrol every day, and every tanker that crossed the channel risked being blown apart by U-boats. There had to be another way. He filled his notes with sketches, reels, couplings, steel conduits, pressure equations. Ideas that would have sounded insane to any reasonable mind. The distance between southern England and Normandy was roughly 70 miles. Even with perfect pressure control, oil would cool and thicken long before it reached land. The resistance along the pipeline would devour the flow. When he presented his plan to the British Petroleum Board, the room erupted in laughter. "This is fantasy," one admiral said. "A poem, not a pipeline." What saved the idea was one sentence from Winston Churchill, spoken during an engineering briefing at the Admiralty. Someone mentioned the poet's proposal. Churchill looked up, eyes gleaming, and said quietly, "Give the poet a workshop." That single order changed history. Hartley was summoned the next morning and given access to naval engineers, research budgets, and a disused factory on the Isle of Wight. For the first time, his sketches began to breathe. The first prototypes leaked, burst, and failed spectacularly. Seawater gushed into testing chambers. Welders quit. Accountants complained about wasting steel that could have built tanks. Hartley didn't care. He adjusted diameters, reinforced joints, modified pressure pumps, and replaced copper gaskets with lead-tinned alloys. When one test finally held a steady flow across a 5-mile stretch of simulated seabed, he wrote in his diary, "Not a dream anymore. It hums like a living thing." He wasn't alone. Young welders and draftsmen began to call the project the Beast. Each failure taught them something the textbooks never could. By the end of 1942, the poet had become the architect of the most ambitious piece of wartime engineering Britain had ever attempted. No one outside that factory understood what was being built, not even the workers who hammered the joints and polished the steel. All they knew was that the man with the oil-stained hands wouldn't stop smiling, because, for the first time in years, the impossible had given him permission to exist. By the summer of 1943, the impossible had begun to take physical form. On the Isle of Wight, the docks thundered with noise, cranes screeching, welders sparking, steel plates groaning under weight. Workers gathered as a monstrous structure took shape. A floating reel of metal 10 meters high and weighing nearly 1,600 tons. It turned slowly in the salt air, its surface gleaming like the skin of some mechanical whale. They called it the Conundrum, because no one, not even the men building it, fully understood how it would work. The Conundrum's purpose was both simple and staggering: to spool 130 kilometers of continuous pipeline, coil it like thread, and unroll it across the English Channel. The pipe itself, made from mild steel coated with layers of tar and hemp, had to withstand pressures exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch. If the current shifted or a weld failed, it would rupture instantly, flooding the seabed with oil and destroying months of work. Yet the engineers were undaunted. For them, this rotating monster was not madness, but proof that human will could defy arithmetic. When the prototype was rolled out for testing, crowds lined the harbor. Housewives, soldiers on leave, and children stood on crates to catch a glimpse of the spinning Titan. As the destroyer HMS Perseus began towing the Conundrum out to sea, someone in the crowd shouted, "It's alive!" Newspapers described it as the Iron Whale of Wight, and the phrase stuck. Its slow rotation was mesmerizing, a sound between a heartbeat and a clock ticking away the war. In one rare color footage later archived by the Combined Operations Film Unit, the Conundrum appears almost surreal. Sunlight flashing off rivets, seagulls circling overhead, men in overalls riding its frame like ants on a god. Yet beneath the spectacle lay fragile precision. The cable tension had to remain constant within 2%. The turning speed couldn't exceed half a knot. One engineer later recalled, "If she twitched too fast, she'd tear herself apart." Among the spectators that day was a group of captured German technicians temporarily assigned to observe British harbor procedures. One of them, a draftsman named Otto Weiss, watched in stunned silence. In his notebook, later recovered by Allied intelligence, he wrote only 6 words: "They build poetry with steel." The Conundrum's voyage became legend. It spun day and night, ferrying an artery of oil beneath the channel. To the people on shore, it was a wonder of engineering. To those who understood what it meant, it was something else entirely, a quiet revolution, proving that imagination, once set in motion, could conquer oceans. By early 1944, Pluto had become one of the most tightly guarded secrets of the war. Its existence was hidden beneath code names, its purpose buried under false paperwork and misdirection. Yet, in the chaos of the channel, secrecy has limits. One stormy March night, German minesweepers recovered a fragment of strange metal tubing from the seabed near Calais. It was 2 meters long, coated in tar, faintly smelling of oil. The discovery made its way up the chain of command to Kriegsmarine Intelligence, which dutifully filed it as recovered section of cable, non-electricals. The report, dated April 1944, concluded that the fragment may belong to a magnetic decoy system or an abandoned communication line. No one in Berlin believed Britain capable of pumping thousands of gallons of fuel across the channel. The idea violated both engineering precedent and German self-perception. If they couldn't do it, no one could. The pipe was labeled Trümmerschrott, scrap metal, and forgotten. That dismissal became one of the most ironic moments of the war. For while German physicists were measuring trajectories for V-2 rockets, British engineers were quietly mastering fluid dynamics on a continental scale. The enemy looked for thunder and fire and missed the quiet heartbeat beneath the sea. At Camp 198 in Kent, Friedrich Adler read the captured report months later during an interrogation. The British officer handed him the file and asked, "Would you have recognized it?" Adler scanned the description, then shook his head slowly. "No, we would have laughed." His voice cracked, not out of shame but out of awe. He understood now that the failure was not scientific but psychological. They had been blind, not because they lacked data, but because they lacked humility. Meanwhile, at the coastal stations of Dungeness and Shanklin, Pluto's testing continued. Each day, engineers tracked flow rates with the precision of surgeons, 56,000 gallons per hour on the best days, enough to keep an armored division moving. To most, it was just a number. To Adler, it was a confession written in oil, proof that faith could outpace logic. Years later, in a letter to his wife preserved in the war archives of Hanover, Adler wrote, "We thought science meant control. They used it as trust that steel would hold, that men would not fail, that the sea itself could be taught to obey." He ended the letter with one line that historians rarely quote: "We saw their miracle and called it madness." That night in Kent, as the generators hummed and the pumps groaned in the distance, Adler realized the bitter truth, that the greatest defeat of German engineering had not been military at all. It had been moral. August 19th, 1944. Somewhere beneath the waves of the English Channel, the lifeline of an army stopped breathing. In the middle of the night, every pressure gauge at the Sandown control station dropped to zero. The flow, nearly 1 million gallons a day, had vanished. Silence filled the pipes. The war's invisible artery had gone still. Technicians scrambled across the deck. Men shouted over the roar of the wind, checking valves, pumps, and gauges. On the master console, a single red lamp flickered with the word blockage. The pressure differential was catastrophic. Somewhere between the Isle of Wight and Cherbourg, the line had collapsed. If it couldn't be restored within hours, the Allied advance in France would stall. The tanks at Falaise were already running low on fuel. Amid the chaos, a 23-year-old Royal Navy engineer named Frank Linsell volunteered to go down. No one ordered him. He simply stripped his gear, tied a rope to his waist, and said, "If I don't come back, keep the flow warm. The channel that night was close to freezing. The current ran 12 knots, fast enough to tear a man apart. Linsell dove anyway. Minutes turned into eternities. On the surface, the crew waited, counting by heartbeats. Somewhere below, he found the jammed valve lodged with sea grit and ice, and with bare hands forced it open. When he finally broke the surface, his face was gray, his breath a wheeze. "It's open!" he gasped. The gauges began to climb, 50 psi, 100, 200. Then the deep, throbbing hum returned. Oil rushing once more toward Normandy. The men cheered until their throats burned. One officer lifted Linsell onto the deck and shouted, "He saved the flow!" The phrase spread through every pumping station along the coast until it became an unofficial motto. Not a military slogan, but a human one. From that night onward, engineers treated the pipeline like a living being. They spoke of its pulse and breathing. They tuned its pressure with stethoscope precision. It had become more than machinery. It was the embodiment of persistence, the proof that wars were not only won by soldiers, but by the stubbornness of those who refused to let systems die. When Friedrich Adler later heard the story in camp, he didn't laugh as some prisoners did. He sat in silence and whispered, "He fought the sea with his hands." Then he looked up and asked the guard beside him, "Tell me, did he survive?" The guard nodded. Adler smiled faintly. "Then that's a victory no equation could predict." Viewers, what do you think? Would you have gone into that freezing current for a machine? Would you risk your life for a pipe carrying fuel, not glory? Tell me in the comments below. By the winter of 1944, the PLUTO network had become a ghost that haunted every coastline. Its name was spoken only in coded briefings, its maps locked in drawers marked Operation Bambi. Even the men who maintained it didn't know what they were feeding. They were told only that water must reach France. On paper, it was a civilian utility. In truth, it was the artery that kept the Allied invasion alive. Over 175 million gallons of fuel had flowed through its veins by December, powering trucks, tanks, and aircraft all the way to the Rhine. In the workshops near Shanklin, a handful of German engineers, including Friedrich Adler, were quietly assigned to assist maintenance under supervision. The British treated them less like prisoners and more like technicians who happened to wear the wrong uniform. Adler was startled by their trust. He had expected suspicion, perhaps even humiliation. Instead, he was handed a slide rule and told, "Check the pressure tolerances at junction 3. When the irony was sharp, he was now safeguarding the same pipeline he once called impossible. He performed his duties carefully, almost reverently. The math was perfect, the steel flawless. When he inspected a cross-section of the pipe's weld, he said softly, "We built rockets to destroy cities. You built this to keep them alive." His words were recorded by a British liaison in a maintenance report, not as confession, but as observation. When the war finally ended, Adler and two others, Otto Weiss, the draftsman who had once written, "They build poetry with steel," were sent to the Dover station before repatriation. The officer in charge, Major Harold Price, asked them what they thought of PLUTO now that they had seen it working. After a long pause, Weiss replied, "It should not have worked, but it did, because you believed before you proved." Adler nodded. "In Germany, we only built what could be calculated. Here, you built what was needed." For a moment, the room was quiet, except for the distant pulse of pumps still running under the channel. Major Price closed his notebook and said simply, "Faith is a kind of engineering too. Viewers, let me ask you, in your own life, have you ever believed in something before the math made sense? Have you ever chosen to trust the possibility rather than the proof? Write it in the comments, because sometimes Belief itself is the last form of invention. That night, as Adler was escorted back to quarters, he turned once more toward the coast. The wind carried a low hum from the pipeline station, steady, unbroken. It sounded less like machinery now and more like forgiveness. The war ended, but the pipeline did not fall silent overnight. For months after VE Day, the channel still hummed with the low vibration of oil rushing through iron veins, as if refusing to believe peace could flow through the same conduits that once fed invasion. In the late autumn of 1946, Friedrich Adler returned to England as part of a reconstruction exchange program, one of several German engineers invited to study Allied post-war technology. His hair had gone gray at the temples, his notebook now filled not with equations, but with questions. He visited Dover, where a section of the PLUTO pipeline had been preserved in a warehouse awaiting display. The sea air was sharp with salt and rust. A British curator lifted a tarp to reveal a length of the pipe, pitted, bent, and yet unmistakably alive with memory. Adler reached out, fingertips brushing the cold steel. For a long time he said nothing. Then, quietly, "We had rockets. They had belief." Secrecy. The words were not recorded by a journalist, but by a young assistant who would later file them in the British Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee Report, 1946. A line that summed up the moral architecture of a continent rebuilding itself. Standing beside him was Otto Weiss, now thin and worn, carrying a small notebook of sketches he had drawn in captivity. On the first page was a crude outline of the Conundrum reel, labeled Poetry Machine. When he closed it, he smiled faintly and said, "Maybe we were never meant to calculate everything." Outside the channel stretched, gray and endless, waves rolling against invisible remnants of cable still buried beneath the seabed. That steel, once hidden under secrecy and salt, had outlived the men who made it. It had carried not only oil, but something harder to define. The stubborn faith that intellect could serve compassion, that numbers could protect life rather than end it. In later years, when school children visited the museum, guides would tap the rusted pipe and say, "This is Pluto, the artery that fed freedom." But to Adler, it was something deeper. He would remember the laughter of British soldiers on the beach, the sound of pumps echoing through fog, and that single sentence he heard long ago: "We don't study what can't be done, Calvin, only how to make it happen." He wrote one final line in his diary before returning to Germany: "Some equations are solved by belief, and belief alone." The wind carried the hum of the old pumps across Dover's cliffs that evening, blending with the sea's endless rhythm, as if the earth itself still remembered the sound of faith turned into machinery. History rarely honors the quiet miracles. It prefers the noise of victory parades, the speeches, the flags. Yet sometimes the greatest revolutions happen in silence, in workshops filled with oil fumes, in equations reimagined by tired engineers, in a line of steel that carried more than fuel. PLUTO was one of those revolutions. It was not built to destroy, but to connect, to keep men alive across a sea that had divided them for centuries. When the war ended, its pipes were drained, its pumps dismantled, but its idea endured. That faith and intellect, when guided by necessity, can turn even the absurd into the essential. Friedrich Adler's trembling hand on that rusted pipe symbolized something beyond forgiveness. It was recognition that beneath flags and languages, all engineers speak the same dialect of persistence. The hum of the pipeline has long faded, but if you stand on the cliffs of Dover on a calm morning, some say you can still hear it. A faint metallic heartbeat under the wind, whispering that what once seemed impossible can, with enough courage, become inevitable.